go to the icon. Okay. Do you hear an echo? No. Okay. All right. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. It was a cold day. It was really cold in the morning. And I thought, I don't know if anybody will show up. And then it started snowing. And I thought, oh my God, definitely no one's going to show up. So I'm so glad that few of you were able to make it. But that's a chance we take when we do it in wintertime. You never know how cold or how snowy it's gonna get. So yeah, come on in, Salma. So again, welcome all the people online. If there is any issues, you guys can just let me know in the chat. But hopefully, I think everything is recording and everything seems to be going the way it's supposed to go. Okay, so the topic for today is about the gut-brain connection, right? And I think for those of you who came to our last conversation we had, I think in October or November, were any of you here? It was actually about the gut. Remember some of the stuff we talked about? Yeah, so it was really about gut and inflammation. And at that time, I remember there's a lot of new information and I said, we'll come back to gut. Because again, it's such an interesting topic and there's so much to learn. And it is, for those of you who may not have come across it, it really is really like mind-blowing information. So I thought, let's go back to gut, but this time we actually talk about the gut-brain connection, right? How are they connected? And there's a lot of research going on in this field, and anxiety rates and depression rates have really skyrocketed since the pandemic. And this is one of the areas of research that there's a lot of research in there, but it doesn't really get talked about in the medical circles of how our gut health can really impact our mental health. So I thought that would be a great topic. So here we are, okay. So let's get started with actually, sorry, there's a bit of blocking with that, but I think you can see what I'm trying to say here. So let's talk about the anxiety disorder, right? So this is really the medical definition that I'm giving you here. So it's generalized anxiety disorder. Now, most of us, when we think about anxiety, we think about, okay, people worrying too much, right? But when you look at somebody who's been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, it's really about excessive worry, what they actually described as apprehensive expectation. So this is an intense or extreme sense of fear or dread about everyday situations. It's not like, for example, if I were to go, say, scuba diving, I would have a really anxiety panic attack. My kids, on the other hand, have no trouble with that, right? So it's not certain situations, it's everyday situations like going to work, driving the car. So it's everyday situations are creating an extreme sense of fear or dread, right? And it occurs more days than not for at least 6 months. Right? And when that happens is when you're actually diagnosed as having generalized anxiety disorder. Now, again, people have different levels of anxiety, right? Some of us have anxiety, but we're not necessarily in that, right? Like it's not diagnosed as an anxiety disorder. But again, no matter what form of anxiety you have, gut health is important. And you'll see why that's the case as we go along, right? The thing with anxiety is we often think of it as something in the head, and you can tell someone, maybe someone may have anxiety, and you might say, oh, don't worry so much. But for them, it's much more than that. What may seem like a mental thing, like thoughts in our head, and yes, they have a lot of racing thoughts, but it actually has physical impact on their body. Like it's usually accompanied by sleep disturbances, restlessness, muscle tension. And when you have chronic muscle tension, that leads to chronic pain, right? So a lot of these, it may seem like minor, but they're real physical manifestations of that. Chronic headaches and even GI symptoms, right? They have stomach pain, diarrhea, constipation, all kinds of things attached to the fact that they have so much anxiety. And again, this proves the fact that we always talk about that the mind and body are connected. You cannot separate them. And unfortunately, that has sort of been the evolution of medicine, is we have, from the way the ancient medicine was practiced, we've kind of changed it. We've separated the two. And I think that's led to a lot of these issues where you don't realize how powerful the mind is, right? So here are people with anxiety developing physical symptoms. So this was just a definition. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the treatment options, right? So now let's say you go to a doctor if you've been diagnosed with anxiety disorder. 1 and 2 are usually the mainstay of medical practice, right? If you have a good doctor, hopefully they'll send you to a psychotherapist, right? So there's medications available. Yes, there's medications that will help you, when you have an acute, because a lot of people with anxiety end up with panic attacks, right? So you have medications that will help with that. And there's also medications you take long-term that will actually cut down the number of anxiety episodes and panic attacks you have. Then the other option is the psychotherapy, which is more like a talk therapy, right? It's more cognitive behavior. So they teach you how to deal with those racing thoughts, right? And so they have a lot of tools in their sort of toolbox, psychotherapists, and they'll use that. The other option that's also available is nutraceuticals or natural health products, right? Botanicals, and quite a few have actually been studied. So there's a lot of evidence behind that. Now, people who may not want to start on the medication, again, it depends on the level of your anxiety, right? I always say if it's really severe, then take something that's going to work fast. Because if you're not treating the anxiety, then it's very hard to do all the other lifestyle modifications. So, but again, there are nutraceuticals, there is naturopathic products that can help with that. The last one that doesn't get talked about that I want to talk about today is your gut health, right? And not because there's an evidence for it, there's tons of evidence in literature. The issue is that oftentimes by the time any sort of information, any research makes it into practice, it takes 20 plus years. And they've actually done research to show that at least 20 plus years before that information, the research that people are doing, it actually makes it into practice where medical practitioners are using it, right? So maybe in about 10, 15 years, we'll have it as a part of protocol, but currently people aren't talking about it and they should be. So that's why we started the conversation. Okay, so now that we've kind of described what anxiety is about, what the options available, let's talk about the brain-gut connection, because that's what we're here for, right? Now, many of you, well, how many of you have experienced butterflies in your stomach or a feeling of uneasiness in your stomach, right? So we're familiar with that, right? Even I, like when I'm stressed, I need to go to the bathroom, right? I have a really, my stomach just doesn't feel right. And so this connection between the brain and the gut, we know that the brain is sending messages to the gut. And that's why when we're stressed, again, in the brain, it's affecting how my gut is feeling, right? How my stomach is feeling. Again, people get diarrhea, people get upset stomach when they're stressed, when things are happening in the head. What's really fascinating, and this is really mind-blowing, is this connection, this communication between the brain and the gut is bi-directional. It's not just the brain talking to the gut is actually sending signals to the brain. So how we think and feel affects our gut, which we've all experienced. But what's really interesting is that the condition of the gut impacts how we think and feel. And that's where a lot of research is coming through. Again, there's a lot of research they've done on animal studies, but there are human studies as well that looks at how changing the gut sort of environment has an impact on the, your depression or your mental health or your anxiety, right? So huge area of research. In fact, they're looking at perhaps that, there was a paper I read, I think a few years ago, and they were talking about how perhaps they've had it wrong all along. They should not, in order to, help what's going on in the mind, like depression and anxiety and all these mental health conditions, they should be looking at the gut, right? So there's a lot of interesting research in this field. And it first came about really when they started looking at people who had irritable bowel syndrome. So this, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's different than IBD. It's a condition where you get like stomach pain, cramping, diarrhea, constipation, you can go back and forth. But when they do an endoscopy or colonoscopy, they find nothing physically, structurally wrong, right? So they're like, well, there's nothing going on there. So why is that happening? So first, and what they found was the people who had IBS, had at least twice the rate of depression and anxiety was twice what is found in normal population, like the general population. So they knew that the people who were suffering from IBS had much higher rates of anxiety and depression. And I thought, well, first they thought it was a disease, and then they realized that's when they started doing research, and that's when they found this bi-directional link. And that's when the studies really exploded in studying how this communication is, two-way. You could come and sit here. You don't have to. I'm like, so I can pick on you. You can sit here. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this this kind of understanding really made them realize that we really have two brains. The first brain is what's in our skull, and the second brain is in our gut, right? And what they found is that, in fact, the types of cells, now our brain cells are different than the rest of our cells. You know, they almost look like octopuses. They have these dendrites, right? Same kind of neurons, they're called, the brain cells are called neurons, are actually found in the gut as well, right? And we'll talk more about that. So this is really understanding now that we have two brains, right? And they're looking at a third brain too, but we'll save that for another time. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to understand this relationship between the gut and the brain. We know there's a relationship, right? They've done studies to show that there is communication between the gut and the brain and the gut. So it's by both ways, right? So we want to understand what's going on. How do they communicate, and how can we impact that communication? So if I were to ask you this question, what is the function of our gut? And by gut, you know, I guess everybody hopefully understands, I mean, it's the digestive system, right? Starts from the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and you know, comes out the back end. That's really your digestive system. If I was to ask you, what's the role of the gut? What would you guys say?
I would say it's nutritional demands of the body.
Excellent. Anyone else? So it's digestion, right? Yeah, it will digest your food, and then it will send you the nutrients that it needs. So absolutely, that is the function of the gut, and that's what we understand, right? And that is the main function. But here's the thing. There's more to the digestive system than what meets the eye, right? And that's where a lot of this interesting research is happening, because like I said, our gut is our second brain. And this is called the enteric nervous system. So if you want to read more about it, you'll go and Google search that, and you'll get a whole bunch of information on what this. So you have the central nervous system, which is in our head. That's the brain. Then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all these nerves that go to every end of our body and every organ. And then there's the enteric nervous system, which is the same kind of cells which are present in our gut. And they found that this actually really runs everything that goes in the gut. So in fact, it can actually, if you were to cut off the sort of the connection between the enteric, the gut brain, and the main brain, our gut will still run based on what's doing our main gut doesn't need the brain here to actually do its digestive function. So, but again, there's a lot of stuff we don't really know about the enteric nervous system. So that's one thing about the gut that's more than the digestion. And the other thing is the gut microbiome. Now, we talked about that last time. Anybody remember? Yep, gut microbiome. And we'll talk more about that. I think it's in the next slide, or maybe not. Okay, we'll come back to that. So anyways, these two things are what goes beyond the digestion, okay? So then the question is, how is the brain talking to, how is that, remember we talked about that they are talking, that the brain in the skull is talking to the brain that's in the gut, right? And it's both ways. How is it talking? So there's many different ways. And I thought if I go through all of them, it's going to cause a lot of confusion. So I'm just going to stick to one, which is really a main one, is through this specific nerve, which is known as the vagus nerve. Has anyone heard of the vagus nerve? No? You've heard, yeah. There's a lot of stuff going on the vagus nerve, right? In fact, they have some therapies where they stimulate the vagus nerve to actually help depression, especially depression that's really resistant to drugs. So this vagus nerve, now, if you look at the picture of the nerve, right, this is, like I said, our nervous system is really made up of what I would call information highways. So if you can imagine the nerve as being like a big long highway of 407 perhaps, right? So there's information going one direction, information going the other direction, right? So it's a highway of information. That's what nerves do, right? And what's special about the vagus nerve is part of the brain. So it's a nerve that comes out of our central nervous system, of our brain. And it comes down, it goes to the heart, it goes to the gut, it also goes to the lungs, and then other few places. But those are the main three areas that it goes and sends information to. It's also part in the central nervous system. It's part of the brain that controls the mood. Okay? So this specific nerve coming out of our head, going to the gut, is responsible or it's serving the area that controls our mood. So you can imagine if information from the gut is going upwards and is telling the brain that something is happening here, brewing here, it's going to affect our mood, right? Because it's the vagus nerve that controls the mood. That's one of the nerves that controls the mood. Our emotional and cognitive functions are connected to our gut function via this nerve. Because remember, it's an information highway. It connects to sections, like say from Mississauga to Aurora, right? So if Aurora, something's going wrong in Aurora, the information gets to Mississauga through this pathway, right? So, and what vagus nerve is involved in the brain is mood and cognition. So does that make sense how this connection is happening, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what we want to know, because now we know it's the vagus nerve that's sending that information back and forth, what's influencing the vagus nerves, right? Again, the Gen Z, if you want to call it, the terminology is influencers, right? There's influencers everywhere on social media. Well, who is influencing the vagus nerve? And this is the gut microbiome, right? As one of the biggest influencers of the vagus nerve. So if there is something off with the gut microbiome, the messaging that the vagus nerve is sending to the brain is something is off. It's sending all kinds of bad information, and then the brain doesn't function like it should. Okay, so then the next question is, oh, actually, before I ask the next question, let's talk about the gut microbiome, right? Because if they are the major influencer on the vagus nerve, and we know that the vagus nerve is the one that's communicating between the gut and the brain, we need to figure out what is this microbiome about, okay? So this is an old slide. I had it last time as well. And again, it is really an ecosystem of living organisms inside of us, right? An ecosystem would be like if you go into the forest, right? You have your trees, you have your bugs, you have your birds, you have your animals, right? That's an different kinds of living creatures. Inside of us, there's trillions of living creatures. In fact, there's one place I read that we have more of these viruses and bacteria than human cells. So we are more bacteria than humans, which is mind-blowing, right? They're saying approximately 38 trillion microorganisms in an individual, in a person, right? That's the approximate. So that's a lot of these creatures. Most of them are bacteria, I would say about 80 to 90%, and some are fungi and viruses, right? So that's why we kind of go back and forth between microbiome and bacteria, because most of them are these bacteria. Now, it's a fine balance between the good bacteria that actually give us health benefits and the bad bacteria that are disease-causing, right? So although all of them are really like squatters, they're rent-free living in our gut, but some of them are there, they actually do a lot of things for us, right? So that's how they pay our rent, through services. And we talked about that last time. They have a huge influence on the nervous system as well as the immune system. And that's when we talked about inflammation, we talked about how the gut microbiome affects the immune system, and that's how it can cause all this inflammation, right? But what's really good is that these little creatures here are influenced by the environment, and we can control the environment, right? So eventually what I wanted to really bring you guys all back to the fact that yes, the vagus nerve is controlled by the microbiome, but the microbiome are influenced by the environment that they live in, and that's in our control, right? So the agency comes right back to us. So a little bit about these living organisms, and again, this is an older slide as well. They help us absorb food, digest food. They produce vitamins. You know, a lot of the B vitamins are produced by them. They produce hormones, vitamin K. The other thing is really important, and you'll understand also in terms of anxiety and mental health, is they produce these, they call metabolites or chemicals. When they digest our food, they increase certain chemicals that increase inflammation in our body, right? Or they can produce chemicals that decrease inflammation, depending on which bacteria are living in our gut. That's why it's so important to have a good balance and have more of those bacteria that are actually decreasing inflammation, right? And less of those who are increasing inflammation. They also protect the lining of the gut. Remember, our gut is exposed to a lot of stuff that we take in, we ingest. A lot of outside stuff goes in, right? In order for our body to in order for the body to make sure that all the stuff that we take in, only the nutrients, the good stuff gets into the bloodstream, that lining of the gut has to be really tight, right? It's very specific. It only allows certain things. And what really helps them is these bacteria. They almost like form like a line of, like almost like a covering on top of the lining of the gut, so that things don't get in unless they're supposed to get in. And you may have heard about, what's the name? I think the term they use is leaky gut. Anybody heard about leaky gut? Yeah. So it's the same. When your gut microbiome is not balanced, you can cause leaky gut, or the scientific term is increased intestinal permeability, which means it's almost like holes in that lining, and things which are not supposed to get in, get in. And once they get in, that's when you get a lot of these, because once they're in the bloodstream, they can go anywhere, right? So that's why they really play an important role to make sure that things don't get into our blood that are not supposed to get in. So these bacteria have a huge role. And this is just some of the things I've mentioned. There's a lot of other roles they play. They also detox chemicals and pesticides out of the body. Even some of the excessive hormones. There's actually a lot of research going on in something called estrobiome. So there's a group of bacteria that actually remove the excessive estrogen from the body. And a lot of the, problems that a lot of women have is because of excess estrogen buildup. So perhaps if we have different bacteria, they would remove that estrogen, right? So a lot of research going on in that direction as well. So remember I talked about how these microbiomes, as much as the influence they have on the vagus nerve, we have a lot of influence in them. We are the influencers for these influencers. And by that, I mean, it's an environment we're creating in our gut, right? And of course, number one is your stress, right? And I always tell people who work with me in terms of their gut, I tell them, no matter how much you work on your gut, you can buy the most expensive probiotics, you can do all kinds of stuff, eat organic stuff. But if you don't control that stress, it's gonna keep killing the bacteria. It's gonna keep killing the good bacteria. So it's really important to work on that before you really start investing in your gut health. Sleep patterns, right? If you're not sleeping well, that's going to impact the community of bacteria. The food we eat, absolutely huge factor, right? The standard North American diet, which is high fat, high sugar, processed, that is not helpful. There's a lot of evidence that they've shown that diet really kills off the good bacteria. Irregular bowel habits. That's another one I find that a lot of people, and I remember when in pharmacy, we were told that, okay, if somebody has a bowel movement every 3 days, that's their normal, that's okay, right? It was only when I did nutrition, I'm like, oh, that's not supposed to be normal. You're supposed to actually have a bowel movement every day, right? And when your bowel habits, and oftentimes I find, especially with the elderly, they're like, well, they won't talk about it. They're like, yeah, I had loose bowel movements for the last 3 months. Like, that's a big deal, right? Irregular bowel movements are going to impact the gut microbiome. Your digestion is really important. And by that, I mean, not just what you eat, how you eat. And some of you might remember, and if you don't, you can always go back to the slides that I have on our website. I had a whole slide on optimizing digestion. How do you make sure it will be chewing your food well, right? Making sure that you do mindful eating, not mindless eating, not in front of your screen, right? So all kinds of these things that have a huge impact. It sounds simple, but they're very effective. And chronic use of antibiotics. And that I really mean like chronic. I don't mean if you have a bladder infection, you take an antibiotic, that's going to cause a problem, right? Because you do need antibiotics when you do need them. But if you've been on it for a long time, then it's definitely having an impact. And I think, and if you are suffering from mental health issues and you've been using a lot of antibiotics, it's definitely a good idea to look at your gut health, because that's definitely having an impact. It's really sort of messed up your gut microbiome. So ideally, what we are looking for is that balance, right? When you have the gut microbiome, we have more of the good bacteria, even though it's not like not having any of the bad bacteria, because some of these bad bacteria are really our resident bacteria. They're supposed to be there. It's just they're supposed to be in there in small numbers. So when you don't have enough of the good bacteria, that's when they go up, right? So the key is to maintain a good number of good bacteria so that the bad bacteria kind of stay below. When that doesn't happen is when you end up with what is called gut dysbiosis, right? So you may come across that name. What it really basically means is that your resident bacteria, which are your normal, have been off balance. You have more of the bad bacteria, less of the good bacteria. And the third thing that's really important when it comes to dysbiosis is that there's loss of diversity of organisms, right? Remember I said there's trillions of them, right? And every sort of, they're different, there's kind of like species, and then there's, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like any sort of organism, right? They belong to a bigger class, and then they have a smaller class. Like, for example, the cat's part of the lion family, but you know, it's part of the lion family, right? So the same idea with these microbiomes is that there's so many of them, and you need diversity, right? Let me give you like example. Let's say if you have clothes in your closet, right? If you have 50 sets of outfits, right? But they're all gray or black. That's the color. That would be Haider's closet. Gray or black. Or you have my side, and you know, being of East Indian heritage, you know, the cultural clothes are very colorful. So I have purple, there's yellow, there's red. Like I have clothes as well, but there's a lot of diversity in color. And basically what I mean when you talk about organisms is that you need different types. You don't need one or two of the same, because the more diversity you have, the more functionality you get, because different bacteria do different things. Does that make sense? So you can have good bacteria, you have a higher number of good bacteria, but if you only have one or two or five types of them, that's still considered an imbalance in your gut microbiome because you don't have enough diversity. Okay, so that's basically how you would define a gut that is not the gut microbiome that is off balance, right? That is not balanced. And when things are not in balance when it comes to these bacteria, that's when they start having an impact on your health. So this is really just to summarize, because I know I gave you a lot of information, kind of get stepwise, but to start off, we now know that we have two brains. One is in our skull and one is in our gut, right? That two brains communicate with each other, like it's a bi-directional. So the brain, the brain in our head tells the gut brain what to do, or the gut what to do. And what happens in the gut through this specific nerve, vagus nerve, will tell the brain how to feel, right? And that's why we come right back to, we were talking about anxiety. And again, it relates to other stuff such as depression as well, is that if your second brain is not doing well, if the information from the second brain is off balance, it's going to affect your mental health. And what is the information, where's the information coming from that's being transferred? It's coming from the gut bacteria. The gut microbiome is what controls this vagus nerves and the information that goes from the vagus nerves, from the gut to the brain, okay? So does that kind of make sense? Okay, because that's like a big piece to understand that where's the connection, right? And it really is the gut microbiome. And so if the gut bacteria ain't happy, no one's happy, really, because we really need to make sure that the good bacteria being fed well, that they have what they need, even though they're not paying rent, they're giving us services. So we need to make sure that they're happy. And that's basically in terms of when we're talking about anxiety and mental health, when your gut bacteria are off balance, right? When you have dysbiosis, when you have too much of the bad bacteria, not enough diversity, and too little of the good bacteria, a few of these things can happen, right? Again, remember when we talked about inflammation, we said inflammation is really at the root cause of a lot of these chronic illnesses, including anxiety and depression, okay? When you have these bad bacteria, remember I said they produce these metabolites or these chemicals as a byproduct, that these chemicals, and one specifically called LPS, can increase inflammation, okay? The good bacteria, so these are the bad bacteria, they're producing this LPS, which increases inflammation. Then you don't have enough of the good bacteria. Now, the good bacteria are producing something called short chain fatty acids. These are the well-known studies that have been done, right? And this specific metabolite or chemical actually decreases inflammation. But if we don't have enough good bacteria, we don't have enough of the short chain fatty acids, we have more of the LPS. And on top of that, remember these bacteria also produce these chemicals known as neurotransmitters. You know about serotonin, right? That's what's used for the happiness in the brain. There's GABA, there is acetylcholine. A lot of these are produced by these bacteria, the good bacteria. Now, if they're not being produced because we don't have enough of them, then you don't have enough neurotransmitters. You have more inflammatory chemicals. You have less of the anti-inflammatory chemicals. And on top of that, because now we don't have good bacteria protecting the lining of the gut, you can get things going right into the bloodstream. So these inflammatory markers get into the bloodstream, go into the brain, and cause what is called neuroinflammation, right? So this is how, and again, a lot of this information is also when you have too much LPS, it sends information through the vagus nerves to cause inflammation in the brain, right? So there's a lot of this. Not only are the chemicals getting into the brain, information because of what's happening, because the gut bacteria are off balance, through the vagus nerve, information is going to the brain that, you know, that causes these mental health and depression and all kinds of other issues with mental health. So this is just a very brief sort of, it's very complicated, this thing, but I've just given you some ideas of what is actually happening at a chemical level to change the brain chemistry when our gut is off balance. So I think this is one of the last slides, is that, so what to do if you are, because you start off in anxiety, I want to bring it right back, right? If you suffer from anxiety or any mental health issue, or if you know someone who does, right? My suggestion is always to take an integrative approach. What that means is that use the medications and or nutraceuticals that you need to manage the symptoms. Oftentimes I get clients who are very scared of going on medications because they think they'll never come off. And I always tell people there's only few things you can't come off. It may take you some time, we have to wean you off, but it's not like you have to be on it forever. But if you don't do anything else in terms of your sort of gut and your sort of more root cause approach, then you will have to take this, right? But if you want to take an integrative approach, take those medications so you feel better, so then you can start working on yourself, right? Then you can consider doing a gut reset, like really look at your gut. Are you doing the right things in terms of your diet? Are you doing the right things in terms of you know, your digestion? Is the digestion good? Are your bowel movements good, right? Are you having any stomach issues? Do you have too much acidity? Do you have too much diarrhea or any of that stuff, right? That show that there's something is off. You can also consider gut testing. Now, in the past, it wasn't as easily available. And when I did my gut test about 5 years ago, it was fairly expensive as well because it goes to US. I paid, I think, $400 US. It is a little cheaper now, but it's more widely available. So it is something I can order for my clients. I don't usually suggest that as a first line because it is expensive. I think it's about 200 something, 210 or 20 US dollars. So it's not cheap. But it is something, if you've tried other things, if you want to know. So what they do is they actually look at the stools. They took a stool sample, and then because the technology is now available to actually map everything. So they can actually look at it, and it's quite comprehensive. I've looked at the results, and they'll tell you, this is what's growing. You know, these are the bacteria, the numbers. What is your diversity percentage? Is it good, bad? So it's a pretty good test. But it doesn't have to be first line. You know, there's a lot of things you can do without really knowing what's going in there, right? Just in terms of your diet and how you eat and all that stuff. And again, stress, you've got to reduce stress. If you are living a life which is on the go, you know, and some of the stress can be very subconscious as well, it's really important, if you want to work on your gut, is to really do work on the stress level, because if you are living in that sort of flight or fight mode all the time, you are going to be impacting your gut. And the last one is really get support, because anxiety and mental health is one of those things where people feel like there's, you know, because they feel it's in their head, right? These are thoughts, and they're like, well, I should be able to control it. It's really connected, like we just learned. It is connected to a lot of stuff, right? It's not just going to happen like that, right? So get support. You don't have to suffer alone. In fact, I've seen people, you know, who suffered greatly, and you know, in close family members who have suffered from anxiety to the point of panic attacks, and taking that approach, they're like thriving now. You know, so it is possible. There's always hope. You don't have to suffer, get support. There's a lots of ways of healing this. And I think that is the last one I have. So I put some, because you will have the recording, I'll send it to my email list. This is just some of the review articles. If you really want to learn more about it and what we talked about, you can go and read some of that stuff. And they are available. And so, yeah, that is my last slide. I did want to talk about a couple of things that we have coming up. This workshop, next one will be February 25th. I don't know exactly, the library is booked. I don't know exactly how the weather is going to be either because we're going to be in February, but it's going to be about on a topic of heart health because February is heart health and there's a lot of things we can talk about the heart. And if there's a specific topic you guys are interested in, just email me, but I don't know the exact topic. Well, if you're part of my email, you will get the information. And I also wanted to share this. I know some of you have already seen it a couple of times because I did send emails out about it. So this is a stress management course I do once a year. This is the 3rd year running it. And it really is my, I guess it really was my passion project. You know, I really put a lot of stuff that I learned and I worked on myself because that has been, you know, really managing my nervous system, regulating my nervous system has been a game changer for my own health. And so I kind of put that together to share with people to teach you the tools. So we really do kind of go, it's a course where I actually take you, again, I have a methodical approach with everything. So we go through understanding our emotions, understanding our nervous system response, and then the tools like, you know, how do you actually work with a trigger that's turned on your nervous system and how do you calm it down, right? And it's a lot of sort of introspection, a lot of inner work. And I know there is a cost involved with it. And one of the reasons why I do it is because when you invest in yourself, you will work on yourself, right? It is how usually things work is because there's a lot of introspection, a lot of work that goes in. But I'm telling you, this is a game changer, you know? So again, if it's calling you, if it's not calling you, it's not your time. You know, it comes every year. I do it once a year. So, you know, if it's calling you, you can register. There is still some room. And Sunday is the deadline. If it's not calling you, it will come back again next year, hopefully. That's all I wanted to share with you. And you know how to get in touch with me. Just make sure you join my email list if you're not on there so that you know when things are coming, when the next workshop's going to be. And I promise I won't spam you. I try to send once a week, but usually ends up once every 2 weeks that the email comes out. So that's it. And we have good time to take some question and answers. Let me just turn the recording off.
Just a moment, I should have written down my questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have just